An illustration of the Minuteman shows a farmer with his plow, while his neighbor is running by the fence with a musket on his shoulder. You can almost hear him saying, "Drop your plow, the British are coming." A little boy has fetched a powder horn and musket for the farmer. In 1636, an order of the General Court of Massachusetts Bay Colony was passed to consolidate local militias into 3 regiments. All able-bodied males between the ages of 16 and 60 were required to take part. This is regarded as the birth of the National Guard. During the French and Indian, or 7 Years' War, Benjamin Franklin's Join or Die drawing shows segmented parts of a snake with initials representing each colony. New England, of course, is the head of the snake and the biggest part of the snake. It was a call for the colonies to unite against a common foe, combining the British regular army with colonial militias. From this map of the most inhabited part of New England from 1755, the westernmost part of the province of Massachusetts Bay is clearly the least inhabited part. A road led from Boston to Springfield, which then turned south to Hartford because settlers would reach the Connecticut River Valley and be daunted by the line of mountains, the so-called Berkshire Barrier. Also, it was disputed land, as New York claimed the territory up to the Connecticut River. In 1758, Lord Jeffrey Amherst, traveling from Boston to Fort Ticonderoga, decided to take a Native American path from Blandford through the wilderness, rather than travel to Hartford. He designated some men to cut down some trees and make a wider path, so that his armies could march as the British were trained to march. Following the French and Indian War, the Crown needed to reimburse its army for the defense of the colonies. A hefty tax burden was levied on the colonists. After the Boston Tea Party, the coercive or intolerable acts were imposed, chiefly affecting Boston. In the summer of 1774, Berkshire County showed its support of the seaport with a non-importation agreement to boycott British goods and the closing of the courts in August as a protest against royally appointed judges. In September of 1774, with the province on edge, there was a false alarm. A cache of ammunition and guns were stored in a powder house in present-day Somerville, and the British forces, to prevent such ammunition to end up in the hands of the unruly colonists, hauled the supplies back to Boston. An alarm spread through the colony, along with rumors that the Navy was landing in Boston and was going to take over the entire province, or that 6 men were shot and killed. Tens of thousands of men marched towards Cambridge to protest this action, including several men from Lenox who were waved off in Westfield. General Thomas Gage, appointed by the Crown as Royal Governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay, called for a session of the Great and General Court to meet in Salem on October 5, 1774. On September 28th, representatives from the various towns in the province were on their way to Salem when Gage issued a proclamation dissolving the court due to the present disordered and unhappy state of the province. But since the delegates, including Colonel John Paterson of Lenox, were already on their way to Cambridge, they defied Gage and decided to hold court without him, illegally as it turns out, creating the First Provincial Congress. In this Congress, there were specific instructions on forming special militia companies, who shall equip and hold themselves in readiness, on the shortest notice from the said Committee of Safety, to march to the place of rendezvous. In other words, ready to go at a minute's notice. On December 26, 1774, Lenox held a special town meeting at the dwelling house of John Whitlock, where funds were appropriated to pay Captain Edward Gray, who went to Boston in the powder alarm. At that same town meeting, Colonel Paterson, who had returned from that first provincial congress which adjourned December 10, 1774, convinced his fellow townsmen that war with Great Britain was inevitable. At his urging, the town voted to stockpile ammunition. And how else did they prepare? Paterson trained men to be special militia companies, using the manual exercise as ordered by His Majesty in 1764. These were the same exercises that the British Army was using, so our Minutemen would practice arms at the same level as their potential opponents. The manual provided 14 steps to prime, load, and fire a musket. A proficient Minuteman would be able to get 3, maybe 4 shots off a minute. The companies of Minutemen in Berkshire County were training from the fall of 1774 right through the winter into 1775. Where was the training ground for the Minutemen in Lenox? The quick answer is we really don't know. There was no village green on Main Street in 1775, which originally formed an S-curve and partially swampland. There is one reference to a training ground, and it's found in the book Lenox in the Berkshire Highlands, written by DeWitt Mallory. His wife was a Walker, a descendant of Judge William Walker. In one of the chapters, Mallory refers to the movement of the county seat from Lenox to Pittsfield. One of the arguments was that Old Stockbridge Road was too steep, so Mallory wrote that Lenox tried to remedy that difficulty immediately by putting another road of easy grade right through her training ground, where now the Episcopal Church stands. It's hard to imagine this scene without Trinity Church, Kemble Street, or perhaps even Walker Street. Most town meeting in those days would have been held at the meeting house, which functioned as church and town hall. The church on the hill replaced the first meeting house. As a matter of fact, at a September 1775 town meeting, one of the articles is to finish off the lower part of the meeting house as quick as possible. When they weren't meeting at the meeting house, they met at various dwelling houses or in taverns, like the dwelling house of innholder John Whitlock. A few years from 1775, Whitlock was accused of being inimically disposed and dangerous to remain in the States of America because he was a Tory. On April 10, 1775, a special town meeting was called for April 14th, and the warrant as posted was to see whether the town will come into some measures to procure a number of arms for the Minutemen. The arms approved at the April 14th town meeting were 40 muskets, each with bayonets and cartouche box. 5 days later, shots were fired on Lexington Green. A cartouche box is also known as a cartridge box. There was a wooden insert with some holes that would hold pre-made musket ball cartridges. The cartridges were prepared by rolling a paper tube with a pre-measured amount of gunpowder in it and a musket ball at the bottom. The soldier would tear the top of the cartridge with his teeth, pour a little of the powder into the firing pan, and ram the remaining wad into his musket. You can imagine how important it was to keep these paper cartridges from getting wet. In fact, this is where we get the expression, keep your powder dry. The other thing this illustrates is that one of the requirements to be a Minuteman was to have a set of opposable teeth in order to tear the cartridge. A quote from the history of the county of Berkshire, Massachusetts reads, "Lexington battle was fought on the 18th of April, 1775. News of it arrived in Berkshire on the 20th about noon, and the next morning at sunrise the regiment of Colonel Paterson were on their way, completely equipped in arms and generally in uniform." The Battle of Lexington was actually fought on April 19th. The courier sent to warn the province did not wait for shots to be fired in Lexington, but rode on the signal given on the evening of April 18th that the British forces were on their way to destroy stores of ammunition at Concord. Incidentally, they would not have shouted, "The British are coming," since pretty much everyone then was British. Instead, they warned, "The regulars are out." The news arrived in Berkshire County on Friday the 21st, and the companies from the 2 Berkshire regiments were ready to march the next morning. Many of the local accounts make the claim that the regiment of Colonel Paterson were on their way. But we should not take this to mean that Paterson's regiment, which represented towns from Stockbridge to Williamstown, marched as a unit. Other accounts make it clear that individual companies would have marched from their respective towns. One of those companies was formed in Lenox. Contained in the Lexington alarm rolls at the Massachusetts State Archives is a true return of Minutemen that marched from Lenox in Captain Charles Dibble's company in Colonel Paterson's regiment. The list included a fifer by the name of Raphael Porter and a drummer by the name of Jacob Goodrich. The musicians held specific roles in the company: to lift the spirits of their fellow soldiers and to accompany the troops as they marched through the towns on their way to battle. Additionally, when the soldiers reached camp, the musicians kept time as the men performed their exercises. During the battle, they played cues for specific troop movements. All but 2 on this list were from Lenox, with the exception of Nathaniel Coleman of Gageborough, which is now Windsor, and George Leonard of Stockbridge. Captain Dibble owned a home and tavern on the county road from Stockbridge to Pittsfield. Now, this is not Dibble's Tavern. This is the Interlaken mansion owned by David W. Bishop. But part of this home was built on remnants of the old tavern. A popular meeting place, it also served as a temporary jail after the war, when Lenox became the county seat. In 1922, Interlaken was a surplus building in the hands of David Bishop's son Cortland, field bishop. He was in the process of building a stylish new mansion up the road, so this mansion was demolished. From this photo of Interlaken, taken from Old Stockbridge Road, you can see a fence with a gate, including handsome pillars with lamps. Today, that fence still exists. After Interlaken was demolished, Bishop installed a boulder just past the gate with a plaque that is dedicated to Captain Dibble. Now, how did these men actually get from Lenox to Cambridge? As with the location of the training ground, we don't know. This is an image of Lenox from 1839. If you turn back the clock 65 years, you would see an earlier iteration of the Curtis Hotel, an early iteration of the Church on the Hill, and possibly some dwelling house of Colonel Paterson. There is a receipt for roof shingles in the library's archival collection for Paterson's house, dated 1780, but he was living in Lenox somewhere in 1774, so perhaps there was an earlier dwelling there. With that said, if this is what the roads looked like in 1839, can you imagine what they looked like in 1775? In all probability, Captain Dibble's company would have taken the same route Colonel Paterson took to the Provincial Congress. Here's a survey of Colonel Paterson's 116 acres drawn in 1898. Back in 1775, there was no Sunset Ave or Yonkin Ave. West Street didn't exist yet, nor did Church Street. Kemble Street wasn't built until 1850. It's even hard to tell if Walker Street existed yet. Another survey done by Judge William Walker's descendants sketches a road that ran roughly parallel to the current Walker Street, but behind the town hall. Walker Street itself wasn't built until 1805 as the 10th Massachusetts Turnpike. This map of Massachusetts dates to 1798. At that time, Lenox was the county seat, so one might think that Captain Dibble's company marched from the training ground down a path to the Dale and then took some semblance of Route 20. But Great Barrington, not Lenox, was the county seat in 1775. It's plausible that the Minutemen gathered at Dibble's Tavern on the county road and marched through Lee and Tyringham to pick up present-day Route 23, the approximate location of the Great Road from Boston to Albany. In the winter of 1775, Colonel Henry Knox would take that Great Road to bring the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. Another possible route that the Minutemen may have taken would have been the old Albany Post Road that went through the Bidwell House property in present-day Monterey. In any case, the route would have looked something like this. So imagine this company leaving Lenox and marching on roads like this through Berkshire County. A militia unit usually covered 20 miles in a day on foot, so it probably took about 6 or 7 days to cover the 140 miles to get to Cambridge, with stops at taverns along the way so that they could get more provisions. One thing we know for sure, they didn't have road signs like this to tell them how to get there, whether it was Route 20, Route 23, or the Mass Pike. Dibble's company joined an estimated 20,000 men who converged on the Cambridge and Roxbury area to contain the British regulars in Boston. Once they arrived, some of these men said, "I didn't sign up for a siege of Boston. It's planting season." So a vote was passed in a council of war, which allowed the men to have liberty to return home, not being enlisted in the provincial army, which was newly created on the spot. None of the men in Captain Dibble's company exercised that liberty. They all signed up for 8 months' service that lasted till December 31st, 1775, while 9 men in Dibble's company would end up signing up with the Continental Army for the duration of the war. As part of the siege of Boston, Paterson's regiment was tasked with building Fort 3, as shown on the Siege of Boston interactive map from the National Park Service. The Battle of Bunker Hill happened shortly thereafter on June 17, 1775. Paterson's regiment was held in reserve to repel any possible British advancement out of Boston, but the British forces decided to stay put. By 1822, a historian could find only remnants of the fortification in what is now present-day Somerville. So today, of course, there's nothing left of Fort 3. George Washington was appointed by the Continental Congress as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. In this print by Currier and Ives, he is depicted on a white charger, standing under a majestic elm, surveying his uniformed, disciplined order of troops waiting for his command. Actually, Washington was dismayed by the state of the provincial troops. He wrote, "The people of this government have obtained a character which they by no means deserved. Their officers, generally speaking, are the most indifferent kind of people I ever saw. I dare say the men would fight very well if properly officered, although they are an exceeding dirty and nasty people." The Continental Army siege lasted until March 17, 1776, which is now known as Evacuation Day. The British troops, led by General Howe, faced with Continental cannons on Dorchester Heights, the same cannons that had been hauled by Colonel Knox, boarded 120 ships and left for Nova Scotia. The evacuation of Boston marks the end of military conflict in Massachusetts in the Revolutionary War, before the Declaration of Independence is even published. Colonel Paterson's regiment was ordered to join the forces of General Benedict Arnold in Quebec in an attempt to gain military control of the Canadian province. By the time Paterson's regiment arrived, Arnold was in retreat and the army was raging with smallpox. Arnold advised that Paterson's regiment be inoculated, but the men were not given enough time to recover from the inoculation to fight the next battle. The original 600 soldiers in Paterson's regiment on departure from Cambridge had shrunk to 6. Paterson continued his career with the Continental Army, crossing the Delaware on Christmas Day, 1776, with General Washington. Smallpox inoculation was a controversial topic. In August of 1776, Lenox voted to accept inoculation for smallpox and appointed a committee to oversee and enforce and take sufficient bond of the doctor that he don't spread the infection. The following year, they voted that Captain Oliver Belting, Amos Stanley, and Moses Wood's family would take the smallpox at Amos Stanley's dwelling house, while James Richard shall have the smallpox in his own house, and that his family may take the infection and have it there. These quarantine orders made no mention of inoculation. The result was fatal for James Richards, who died of smallpox July 5, 1777. While some Berkshire-men enlisted in the Continental Army, others were strictly militiamen. For instance, Captain Caleb Hyde was captain of a company of militia which was attached to a regiment commanded by Colonel James Easton. On May 10, 1775, 3 weeks after Dibble's company marched on Lexington alarm, Hyde marched with his own Lenox company on an alarm notice to Ticonderoga, the same notice that would result in the capture of the fort and the possession of its cannons. Hyde rose through the militia ranks, ultimately as Lieutenant Colonel of Colonel Simon's 3rd Berkshire Regiment. In the Battle of Bennington, which took place in August 1777, a special call for Minutemen was made. In Oliver Osborne's E Street book published by the Lenox Historical Society, Josiah Osborne was ready to answer the call. He kept his musket and haversack of provisions where they could be grasped at the sound of the drum as a signal of alarm, and before each noonday meal the haversack was replenished with fresh provisions. Twice he went at the call of the drum, making forced marches through the storm and darkness of the night toward Bennington. At these times his brave young wife loaded the bedding, a few other goods, with their 2 babies, into the cart, yoked the oxen to it, and with the cow hitched to the hind end of the cart, drove the oxen to the nearest neighbor's, where she stayed during the night, leaving the oxen in the yoke, ready for a rapid move towards the south. Here's Osborne's record of 27 days' service in a 17-volume Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors of the Revolutionary War. You'll see it's spelled Orsborne. Elijah Northrop is also included in the E Street book. He kept tavern at his farm during the War of the Revolution. He was referred to in his day as Colonel Northrop, but there doesn't seem to be any record of him ever reaching the rank of colonel, at least not in his numerous variant entries in the Massed Soldiers and Sailors volumes. It may have been a sign of respect, because he and Judge William Walker were the 2 most respected men in Lenox in the early 1800s. His home is still standing on the corner of E Street and Walker. Speaking of Judge Walker, he is said to have been under the command of Colonel Paterson's regiment from the Lexington alarm. Whether with or without a company is not known, according to his son's application for a pension. Walker is not listed in Dibble's company or the Stockbridge companies. Perhaps that's due to the haphazard record keeping, especially at the first conflict. After all, in April 1775, there was still hope, however slim, that separation would not occur. You can view Walker's orderly book as Paterson's Adjutant, as it has been scanned as part of Fort Ticonderoga's online collections. We do know that after 1777, Walker was the superintendent of the recruiting service for the Continental Army in Berkshire County. An envelope full of slips from our archives includes the certificate for Joseph Gregory signing up for 9 months' service. Another slip disqualifies Daniel Wixon, who refused to take the oath of fidelity. So you have a Continental Army with soldiers enlisting for various terms of service, And then you have militias still training, still ready to go at a moment's notice when there's a skirmish or another battle where the Continental Army needs reinforcements. Of the nearly 250 men from Lenox who fought in the Revolutionary War, service ranged from 3 days to the entire war. As the war progressed, General Washington softened his opinion on the use of militia. He recognized the value of the Minutemen to supplement the Continental Army or to harass the British forces while the Army was elsewhere. In a letter written to Samuel Holden Parsons in 1777, Washington declared that the British forces are convinced wherever they make an impression, the country will recur to arms. He came to rely on those men who were willing to put their lives on the line and defend their home fronts at a moment's notice.